Tonight, the clock is still running. Somewhere inside a ceasefire that nobody fully trusts, a 60-day countdown that began on the 17th of June is quietly ticking toward its final hours, and the two governments who signed it cannot even agree on what they actually signed. $100 billion in frozen Iranian money is still sitting untouched in foreign banks tonight, exactly where it was the day the ink dried. The Strait of Hormuz is technically open again. Tankers are moving. Oil prices have slipped below $75 a barrel for the first time since the war began. And by every outward measure, this should be the week everyone starts calling it peace. It is not, because underneath the photo ops and the joint statements, the actual deal, the one about uranium, about weapons, about whether Iran ever gets to enrich anything again, is falling apart in real time, and almost nobody watching the headlines has noticed yet. Here is what you need to understand before anything else. This was never a peace agreement. It was a memorandum, a promise to keep talking for 60 days, while the real fight, the one over nuclear material, gets settled behind closed doors in Switzerland. That 60-day window opened the ceasefire, reopened the strait, lifted the naval blockade, and unlocked a temporary oil sanctions waiver. What it did not do was force Iran to give up a single centrifuge, a single gram of enriched uranium, or a single inch of its nuclear program. Everything that actually matters was pushed into the future, and the future is now arriving faster than anyone in Washington wants to admit. To understand how fragile this moment really is, you have to remember what it took to get here. This is not the first 60-day deadline either side has faced. Back in the spring of last year, President Trump gave Iran exactly 60 days to reach an agreement after sending a letter directly to the man who was then Iran's supreme leader. That deadline passed with nothing signed. Weeks later, Israel launched a war. By February of this year, that war had escalated into full-scale strikes that killed Iran's supreme leader outright, along with one of its most senior negotiators, and installed his son as successor almost overnight. Iran responded by closing the Strait of Hormuz entirely, cutting off a waterway that once carried a fifth of the planet's oil and gas every single day. 6 weeks of open warfare followed before a fragile 2-week ceasefire finally took hold in April, a ceasefire so shaky that both sides spent it accusing the other of violations rather than building toward anything permanent. None of this happened in a vacuum either. Back in October, before any of this year's fighting even began, 3 European powers, Britain, Germany, and France, triggered what is known as the snapback mechanism, a legal trigger built into the original 2015 nuclear deal that reimposed a full set of United Nations sanctions on Iran almost overnight. That single move cut Iran off from international banking, technology, and investment just as sharply as any bomb could have, and it is widely seen as the spark that pushed both sides toward the negotiating table in the first place. And then, when those talks failed, toward war. Understanding that timeline matters because it means the sanctions relief Iran is now fighting so hard to protect is not some bonus feature of this deal. It is Tehran clawing back exactly what it lost 8 months earlier, dollar for dollar, restriction for restriction. Back in Washington, the reaction to all of this has not been uniformly celebratory either. Lawmakers on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and the House Foreign Affairs Committee were pulled into an emergency briefing call within hours of the memorandum being signed, and pointed questions followed almost immediately. Policy groups close to the administration's own allies published memes warning that the agreement, as written, never actually requires Iran to remove its enriched uranium from the country, never sets a firm timeline for the anytime, anywhere inspections that previous agreements always demanded, and leaves open the possibility that once those frozen funds are released, some portion could flow toward entities tied to Iran's own military rather than its civilian economy. In other words, even inside Washington, Even among people who want this deal to succeed, there is real documented anxiety that Iran has already won the most important part of this negotiation without giving up anything that cannot eventually be reversed. They were handed a lifeline, a regime that had just watched its supreme leader killed in an airstrike, its economy gutted by sanctions, its navy humiliated, its air defenses in ruins, was offered a way out. Sanctions relief. Frozen assets. A reconstruction plan. All they had to do was give up the one thing they have spent nearly 2 decades building toward. And so far they have refused to let it go. Right now, tonight, Iran's National Security Committee has issued a direct order forbidding the transfer of its enriched uranium stockpile to any third country. Not to the United States, not to Russia, despite Moscow's own earlier offer to take the material off Iran's hands entirely. Not to anyone. The uranium stays on Iranian soil, under Iranian control, processed by Iranian technicians, or it does not move at all. That single sentence, buried in a state directive most people will never read, may be the moment this entire deal quietly died. So let's not talk about the story everyone in Washington is telling. And the story everyone in Tehran is telling because they are not the same story. And one of them is not true. According to the American side, this was a breakthrough. Vice President J.D. Vance stood in front of reporters in Switzerland and called it a very, very good day. He said Iran had agreed to let international nuclear inspectors back into the country for the first time since the war began. He listed it as one of 4 major achievements, alongside a mechanism to keep the Strait of Hormuz open, a deconfliction cell to manage the ceasefire in Lebanon, and a roadmap toward a final agreement within 60 days. President Trump went even further, posting that Iran had, in his words, fully and completely agreed to the highest level of nuclear inspections long into the future, adding the word infinity in capital letters for emphasis, and accusing what he called the fake news media of trying to make America's victory look small. According to the Iranian side, none of that happened. Foreign Ministry spokesman Esmail Bagai told reporters in Tehran on the very same day that the nuclear program had barely come up in the talks at all. A very brief discussion, he called it. Nothing close to negotiations. Iran's Deputy Foreign Minister Kazem Garibabadi went further still, stating flatly on social media that Iranian officials had not even met with the head of the International Atomic Energy Agency during the Switzerland talks, and that there were no plans, none, to allow inspectors anywhere near the nuclear sites the United States bombed last year. Those sites, he said, would only be examined once a final agreement was reached, and only after every single sanction had been terminated first, not waived. Terminated. 2 governments, 2 accounts of the same weekend. Only one of them can be telling the truth, and the gap between them is not a communication error. It is the entire deal, cracking open in public in real time for anyone paying attention. The money fight tells the same story in miniature. Iran's own lead negotiator, Parliament Speaker Mohammad Bagher Kalibaf, told state media that an agreement had been reached to release $12 billion in frozen funds. Washington has never confirmed that figure. What Vance did confirm was smaller and stranger. Roughly $6 billion held in Qatar, funds already restricted under a mechanism built years earlier to ensure the money could only be spent on humanitarian purposes, nothing more. And when Vance suggested that any newly unfrozen Iranian money should go toward buying American-grown corn, wheat, and soybeans, Iran's own ambassador in Geneva pushed back within hours, insisting that Iran, and only Iran, decides how Iran spends its own money. Now layer in the number that actually explains why this fight is so bitter. The United States wants Iran to freeze all uranium enrichment for 20 years. 20. A full generation. Iran's counteroffer, delivered through mediators in Islamabad, was 5 years, not 20. 5. The talks in Pakistan's capital collapsed over exactly that gap, 4-1, with no bridge in sight. Washington sees a 20-year freeze as the only number that guarantees Iran can never quietly rebuild a weapons-capable program before anyone notices. Tehran sees a 20-year freeze as a life sentence dressed up as diplomacy, a demand no proud nation with real leverage would ever admits it currently cannot locate, cannot verify, and cannot confirm is even intact after months of bombing and reported tunnel collapses at the sites where it was likely stored. Iran says it will downblend that stockpile itself on its own soil, under its own supervision, with the IAEA merely watching from the outside. The United States, at least according to Vance, wants the stockpile fully destroyed, not just diluted, not just monitored, destroyed. Those two positions are not close. They are not converging. They are hardening with every passing week. So which version do you believe? The one where Iran just handed over its nuclear program's future to foreign inspectors and called it a very good day? Or the one where Iran gave up almost nothing, kept its uranium exactly where it is, and is simply waiting out the clock while sanctions quietly lift around it? Because right now, both sides are telling their own populations they won, and only one of them can actually be right. To understand why Iran is playing it this way, you need to look past this specific negotiation and toward a pattern that has repeated itself for nearly half a century, the pattern of a regime that survives by never actually finishing a negotiation. Call it the stall to survive doctrine. It is simple, and it is brutally effective. A government with its back against the wall, facing military defeat, economic collapse, and internal unrest, does not need to win a negotiation. It only needs to keep the negotiation open. Every additional week at the table is a week without new airstrikes. Every partial concession, every working group, every technical delegation sent to Switzerland buys time for the economy to stabilize, for the leadership to consolidate, for the world's attention to drift elsewhere. You do not have to defeat your opponent across the table. You only have to outlast their patience. This is not new behavior from Tehran, and anyone who has tracked these negotiations from the very first round in Oman back in the spring of last year could see this coming. The same sequence played out then too. Talks described by both sides as constructive, optimism from Omani mediators about a peace deal within reach. Reports of a 10-point plan from Iran that was never actually published, and a 15-point counterproposal from Washington that was never published either. And then, when the 60-day deadline that President Trump himself set finally arrived without a signed agreement, the war began. Even the president's own envoys reportedly warned him privately that a deal would be difficult, if not impossible, and blamed Iran for what they described as an attempt to strong-arm the American team at the negotiating table, claiming Iranian officials had even boasted about deceiving international monitors in the past. The pattern is not subtle once you know to look for it. Buy time publicly, concede nothing that cannot be reversed, and let the other side's own impatience eventually force either a worse deal for them or a war that resets the clock entirely. Look at the shape of what Iran has actually conceded so far this time, and you will see the doctrine in action all over again. They allowed the Strait of Hormuz to reopen, but only after securing an oil sanctions waiver that lets them sell crude at full market price again for the first time in years. They agreed to establish 4 separate working groups covering sanctions termination, nuclear affairs, reconstruction, and monitoring, structures that sound like progress but commit Iran to absolutely nothing concrete or irreversible. They let Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi announce publicly that sanctions on oil and petrochemical exports had been waived, that the blockade had been lifted, that a major reconstruction and development plan for Iran had already been launched, framing every one of Iran's core economic demands as already met, while the actual nuclear demands from Washington remain completely unresolved. Notice the pattern. Iran collects the tangible economic wins up front and defers every irreversible nuclear concession to some undefined moment in the future. A future that keeps slipping further away with every passing week of technical talks that produce statements but not signatures. Now let's get into the actual mechanics of what Iran is protecting. Because these four elements are the real battlefield, and understanding them is the only way to understand what happens next. The first is the stockpile itself. 400 kilograms, enriched to 60% purity, a level that has no legitimate civilian use whatsoever, and sits one short technical step from weapons-grade material. Under the old 2015 nuclear agreement, the one President Trump withdrew the United States from back in 2018, calling it a giant fiction built around a murderous regime's supposedly peaceful ambitions. Iran was permitted to hold no more than 300 kilograms, enriched to just 3.67%. What they are sitting on now is by any honest comparison, an entirely different category of danger, and it is Iran's single greatest source of leverage at the table. Every day that stockpile remains unverified and unaccounted for is a day Washington cannot walk away from negotiations. Because walking away means losing all visibility into where that material actually is, and whether it survived the bombing campaign at all. The second is the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway through which roughly a fifth of the world's oil and gas once passed every single day before the war choked it down to a trickle. Iran effectively held the global economy hostage through that strait for months, and reopening it was never a gift. It was a calculated trade. Ship traffic is climbing back toward normal now. 39 vessels crossed in a single day last week, according to shipping analytics firm Kepler, up from roughly zero at the height of the conflict, though still well below the 100 ships a day that used to pass through before any of this began. Yet Iran's own negotiators have made clear they still consider themselves the ones managing that strait, not surrendering control of it, simply choosing for now not to use that leverage while it still benefits them economically to keep the oil flowing. The third is the oil sanctions waiver itself, a 60-day exemption from the United States Treasury that lets Iran sell crude and petrochemical products at full market rates for the first time in years, an exemption Iran secured while keeping every nuclear site closed to inspectors and every ounce of enriched material exactly where it already was. Read that sentence again, because it is the clearest evidence yet of how lopsided this interim arrangement really is. Iranian oil, once sold at a steep forced discount to buyers willing to risk American sanctions, can now move at full global market price. And that alone represents one of the largest economic lifelines Tehran has received in nearly a decade. And the fourth, the one that may matter most of all, is that direct order from Iran's National Security Committee, reportedly issued under the authority of the country's new, younger supreme leader, prohibiting any transfer of enriched uranium outside Iranian territory. This is not a negotiating position. This is a red line drawn in the one place Tehran has never wavered across nearly 2 decades of nuclear diplomacy, through 3 different American presidents, through the original 2015 deal, through its collapse in 2018, through snapback sanctions reimposed by European powers last October, and now through an entirely new war. They will discuss enrichment levels. They will discuss inspection timelines. They will not, under any circumstances currently on the table, let that uranium physically leave the country. And multiple reports from the war itself suggest Iran went as far as collapsing tunnels and mining entrances at key nuclear sites, specifically to prevent any attempt to seize that material by force. It helps to remember what was actually struck during the war, because the 3 names keep resurfacing in every round of these talks. Fordow, buried deep inside a mountain and long considered Iran's most protected enrichment site. Natanz, the country's largest and oldest enrichment facility. Isfahan, home to much of Iran's uranium conversion infrastructure. American officials, according to reporting from inside the negotiations, once demanded that all 3 be fully destroyed and every remaining gram of enriched material handed directly to the United States. That demand alone was enough to freeze an entire earlier round of talks, with the American side reportedly leaving one meeting in Geneva visibly frustrated, while Omani mediators insisted the gap between those two impressions, frustration behind closed doors and optimism in front of the cameras, has defined nearly every single round of this negotiation. And it is defining this one. Two, put those four pieces together and a very different picture of this deal emerges than the one being sold on cable news. Iran secured its economic lifeline. Iran kept its nuclear material on its own soil, under its own control. Iran retained practical leverage over one of the world's most critical shipping lanes. And Iran did every bit of it while allowing the United States to announce progress and technical talks to continue, keeping the ceasefire alive and the airstrikes paused without ever actually crossing its own red line. Even the betting markets tracking this negotiation in real time have grown skeptical. Prediction markets that once priced in a reasonable chance of Iran formally surrendering its uranium stockpile by the end of March have watched those odds collapse toward near zero, sliding lower with every new statement from Tehran reaffirming that the material will never leave the country, and lower still every time Iran's leadership hardens its public position rather than softening it. When traders with real money on the line stop believing a surrender is coming, that tells you something the diplomatic statements never will. So what happens when this 60-day clock finally runs out? Here is the theory that ties every thread of this story together, and once you see it, you will not be able to unsee it in a single headline about these talks again. Iran is not negotiating to win a final deal. Iran is negotiating to survive long enough that a final deal becomes optional. Sign enough to keep the sanctions relief flowing and the bombs from falling again, but never enough to actually disarm. That is the entire strategy, playing out in plain sight, one working group and one carefully worded statement at a time. And the cracks are already spreading well beyond the nuclear file itself. The ceasefire in Lebanon, which was supposed to end alongside this very memorandum, has instead flared back into open violence multiple times in recent weeks, with Israeli strikes killing civilians in the south, including a child and two elderly residents in a single weekend, and Hezbollah refusing to stand down unless Israeli forces withdraw entirely, a demand Israel's own prime minister has publicly rejected, vowing to maintain what he calls a security zone in southern Lebanon for as long as he remains in office. Iran has made clear that a full and lasting truce in Lebanon is a precondition for any comprehensive final agreement, which means every Israeli airstrike in southern Lebanon is also quietly a blow against the broader nuclear negotiation happening hundreds of miles away in Switzerland. And it has already forced at least one round of technical talks to be postponed entirely, with no new date announced for days afterward. Even the head of the International Atomic Energy Agency, a man whose entire job depends on staying neutral, could not avoid naming what is happening. Standing at a nuclear facility in Japan of all places, Rafael Grossi described the dispute between Washington and Tehran as a war of words playing out in public while the real negotiations continue behind closed doors. He tried to sound reassuring, insisting inspections will eventually happen, that the exact timing is not essential. But even he, the one man both governments claim to trust, could not hide his own uncertainty about exactly when or under what terms his inspectors would actually be allowed back inside Iran. Then there is the detail almost too strange to invent, the one that captures this entire standoff in a single exchange. Vice President Vance told reporters that once Iran's frozen assets are released, the money should go toward buying American-grown corn, wheat, and soybeans. Within hours, Iran's foreign ministry spokesman was mocking the idea publicly, pointing out that a war which began in Washington's own stated language with the goal of obliterating Iran's missile arsenal and annihilating its navy, had apparently ended with a plan to enrich American farmers instead, and reminding everyone that Iran alone would decide how it spends its own money, based on nothing more than price and quality, not on what Washington would prefer to sell. So here is the question nobody in either capital wants to answer honestly right now. When this 60-day window finally closes, does it end with a signed, verifiable, permanent nuclear agreement that actually removes Iran's capability to build a weapon? Or does it end exactly the way the last deadline ended, with accusations, with blame, and with the airstrikes resuming right where they left off, only this time with a regime that has had 60 additional days to rebuild, resupply, and prepare? Because right now, this week, both governments are standing at podiums thousands of miles apart, describing the exact Sensei meeting as two completely different events. One side says inspectors are coming back. The other says no such promise was ever made. One side says the nuclear program is finally being negotiated. The other says it barely came up. Somewhere between those two stories sits the truth. And the clock deciding how much longer we get to argue about it is still running, second by second, whether anyone in Washington or Tehran is ready for what happens when it finally hits zero.